Really, the big thing that stuck with me, though, was when he was discussing how we are going to be not just the economy, but I even think in a way culturally changing after this pandemic. And he wrote, as it relates to cities, one of the big losers of the pandemic is likely to be urbanism. People starting a family are more likely to want to leave the cities for the suburbs, and people in general are less likely to want to use public transit. And for those who remain, city planners are likely to want to reduce the number of cars in cities even further to give people more space to avoid each other while walking. He says this is already happening in some cities in Europe, and this will drive even more economic activity to the suburbs. Commuting will be even more difficult as a result, likely intensifying a trend towards telework. And this will further disrupt many other sectors, such as restaurants and offices. We can expect the costs of getting around cities to increase sharply. Joining me right now from CEI, Ian Murray, Vice President for Strategy and the Senior Fellow there at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Ian, pleasure to have you. Really enjoyed your piece, obviously, as we were talking about it on air. And I think that the manner in which you were looking at this is quite unique, because I haven't really thought of the restructuring of essentially how we live in those terms. Tell us about that.
Well, yes, a lot of how the economy has been allocated, especially in cities recently, is based on principles that just aren't going to be there anymore. For instance, cities have been moving towards what we call the Stack'em and Pack'em idea, that more people want to live more densely, more closely to each other, and they want to get away from the car and they want to use public transit. When you pull the linchpin of public transit out from under that, it all falls apart. If people don't want to use public transit, then if you live in a city, you're going to be stuck with things within walking distance. And anybody trying to commute into the city is going to face many more problems, and getting around the city for meetings and so on is going to be much more problematic. So this all really depends on our attitudes towards public transit, and everything that we're seeing out of countries that are really dependent on public transit is that people just don't want to use it anymore.
Yeah, and to that point, that sort of dovetails into one of the headlines that we had earlier today, actually yesterday, where some airlines were saying that airfares could increase as much as 50%, particularly if they incorporate that open middle seat to the social distancing guidelines, the open middle seat on planes. And that made me think about your article, and that it's even perhaps even more widespread than that in terms of people wanting to go out to the suburbs. It might be a little bit easier to navigate telecommuting, but also regionally, it seems to signal that people, at least for a time being, are going to be more locked down and kept to specific regions, because travel may become quite expensive.
Oh, it almost certainly will become much more expensive, especially international travel. And that will just reinforce the trend that we're seeing away from globalization and towards more regional networks. I think one thing that's very interesting, just as a good illustration of how this all ties together, is that restaurants at the moment are demanding caps on the fees that credit cards banks can charge them for using their credit cards. If that happens, then we'll see the end of reward programs. Now, after 9/11, the airline reward programs. After 9/11, the airlines desperately needed more people to fly, so they used rewards programs to get people used to flying again. If we're going down that route of putting more regulations, more restrictions on credit cards, then that is going to disappear. So, this all an indication of how this all ties together. And when you try and turn one knob, several other knobs turn at the same time.
And you also mentioned as well telecommuting, and we've seen these arguments in numerous op-eds for those employees who say, well, we've kind of shown that it's and almost entirely unnecessary for us to be in the office every single day. Do you foresee not just the office place, not just the workplace, maybe changing and revolutionizing in how it operates in the wake of this? But there are a lot of people asking this about schools, or at least a number of different disciplines of education. How much? What's the ripple effect of the change on this? How far does this go?
Well, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned schools, because I think a lot of parents are now realizing, how little their children actually do at school all day. My son is basically doing about 2 hours work, and he's keeping his grades up and everything. Why is he at school for almost eight hours? I think that there's going to be a realization that schools are actually not vehicles for education, as so much as giant daycare programs. And of course, if people are staying at home, then those aren't going to be needed as much. Although many of us who are parents might want to get the children out of the house while working.
Yeah, that's true. I've heard some of that, but you mentioned something so important, and I've heard this from. So my kids have been home, and we homeschooled up to a certain point, and then they went to a school. But now that they're back home, it's when they were homeschooled, it was about maybe 2 to 3 hours of work a day, and they had very engaging curriculum. But you don't have all of the administrative tasks, and I also think that for college families as well. My oldest son's a freshman in college. I think it's really highlighting the inflated cost of higher education as well, when you're actually seeing everything that they're doing. Now, obviously for certain professions, such as the medical profession, and even going into study law. I mean, after you get your undergrad degree, I think that there's obviously some exceptions, but for the most part, I really think that parents' eyes are being opened to this, Ian.
I think that's right. I mean, my daughter is also a freshman in college, but she's an engineer, and so she's really desperately missing that lab experience,
yes.
which I think is. So I think this universities are specialized in STEM in STEM disciplines. I think they're going to survive, and liberal arts colleges are going to be in big trouble. Yes. I'm a classicist by training, and I know that I could have done all the classics work that I needed to remotely. And I think more and more people are going to realize this, especially when my daughter was charged something like $10,000 this year for room and board, and she's having missed at least a quarter of the year. She's only getting back $1,000 in a refund. And I think people are going to be asking why aren't these colleges refunding more? And the racket that seems to have developed there will be exposed.
And I love what you mentioned in the piece as well, because ultimately for us to have a good recovery, these are all things that are going to have to be resolved. I mean, this is the time to have these debates about why things have been established the way they are, and ultimately why they cost the price that they cost.
That's exactly right, and also, why we regulate certain things to stop certain bits of economic activity happening, which actually, we've now learned are actually pretty essential if there's going to be some sort of recovery. This is why at the Competitive Enterprise Institute we call these never-needed regulations. A lot of regulations are being revealed as never having had a proper justification in the first place. That's going to intensify as we discover that there are regulations which were appropriate for the pre-virus model that are completely inappropriate for the post-virus model, and we're going to need something like a regulatory. Congress is going to have to set up a regulatory reduction commission or something like that in order to clean out all the regulatory sludge that has built up over the last 50 or so years.
I'm so glad that you said that. I look back at, even from the start of this pandemic, the regulations that were preventing these private labs that actually did really ultimately lead the way in developing not just quick processing of these tests, but also the private entities that were developing the quick tests that could be performed in just 12 hours. And then, of course, the regulations that we hear that are getting in the way and contributing to the disruption of the food supply chain as it relates to meat products. If these regulations have to be moved during a pandemic, they should not even exist, regardless of whether or not there's a pandemic.
That's exactly right, and it was the health regulations that you mentioned that first drew people's attention to this, but now we're seeing more and more regulations. We know there's a glut of food available that would have gone to restaurants, but the suppliers can't sell that to the public because of labeling restrictions, which in turn are all based on dubious science in the first place. So if we're going to have people starving with the potential for food riots, because when we have plenty of food available, then I think people are going to get really, really angry about these regulations the longer this thing drags on.
I would agree with you. Ian Murray, Vice President for Strategy and Senior Fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Fantastic piece, and I appreciate what you all do over there. And I will link that up so folks can check that out too. Ian, thank you so much for your time today. So appreciate talking with you, and thank you for your piece.